ships are already inside the river mouths when the walls of Medinet Habu begin to speak. Their high prows lean into confusion. Their masts cross a sky of carved stone, and men crowd the decks beneath feathered headdresses and round shields. Egyptian archers stand ready on shore and aboard their vessels. Some enemy ships appear trapped, their crews thrown off balance, their hulls caught in narrowing water where movement becomes impossible. Bodies twist below. Captives are pulled away under guard, above the entire scene, larger than any ordinary man. Ramesses III dominates the composition as the king who saw danger approach and turned it back. The image is violent, orderly, and absolute. Egypt has won. Chaos has been crushed. The king has restored the world. Yet almost everything that makes the scene unforgettable also makes it difficult to read as simple history. The relief is not a battlefield photograph. It is a royal statement created on the walls of a mortuary temple, arranged within sacred architecture, and designed to survive long after the defeated had disappeared. The men in the ships left no matching account of what they believed they were doing, where they came from, or whether they thought of themselves as allies. Their names survive because Egyptian scribes wrote them down. Their appearance survives because Egyptian artists chose how to represent them. Their defeat survives because Ramesses III wanted future generations to understand his reign through victory. Medinet Habu stands on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, where desert meets cultivated land. Built as the memorial temple of Ramesses III, it was more than a place of worship. Its pylons, courts, halls, and walls formed a controlled environment in which the king's victories could be repeated forever. Ritual, politics, memory, and architecture were woven together. A visitor did not encounter neutral records arranged chronologically. The visitor entered a landscape of kingship, where foreign enemies became proof that the ruler had defended Maat, the ordered balance of the Egyptian cosmos, against disorder. The naval battle is among the most famous images from the end of the Bronze Age. It seems to offer a direct window onto a clash more than 3,000 years ago. Scholars have studied the rigging, hull shapes, shields, weapons, clothing, and positions of the combatants. They have asked whether Egyptian archers fired from shore, whether enemy ships were drawn into confined water, whether boarding followed the first volleys, and whether the battle occurred near an eastern Nile mouth or toward the lagoons of northwest Sinai. These reconstructions are plausible, but the evidence remains incomplete. The location has not been securely identified, and the relief may compress several moments into one idealized scene. The carving makes the enemy appear caught by a plan already perfected. Egyptian vessels remain controlled while opposing ships collide, turn, or capsize. Arrows descend upon men who cannot answer effectively. On land, troops wait to seize survivors. The message is less about the uncertainty of combat than the certainty of royal command. Even the confusion is arranged. Every overturned figure strengthens the order surrounding the king. The accompanying texts intensify this effect. They describe foreign lands in motion, peoples gathered together, and a threat advancing through territories already broken. They present Ramesses as the ruler who prepares his frontier, stations forces, and traps the invaders at the river mouths. The language is vast, theological, and triumphant. It resembles older Egyptian victory traditions in which the king does not merely defeat opponents, he reenacts the triumph of order over rebellion. This does not make the account useless. It preserves names, campaigns, military ideas, and political anxieties that would otherwise be lost. But royal inscriptions tell historians both what happened and what the court needed people to believe had happened. Those questions are related, not identical. The enemy groups named in the records include the Peleset, Tjeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh. Modern scholarship often gathers them under the label Sea Peoples, but no surviving source shows these groups using that name for themselves. The phrase is modern, and its simplicity can mislead. It encourages the image of one people arriving from one homeland under one command, like an empire launched across the sea. What survives suggests something more complicated: separate communities, warrior bands, displaced populations, maritime groups, mercenaries, raiders, migrants, and perhaps families moving through a region where older political structures were failing. Medinet Habu presents them as a collective danger because collective danger magnifies collective victory. Distinctions remain in names and costume, yet the composition draws them into one defeated mass beneath royal authority. That transformation is central to the mystery. The walls preserve information, but they also reorganize reality. They show events through the priorities of a state that needed the border defended, the gods satisfied, and the ruler incomparable. Behind the stone image lies a world in genuine crisis. Palaces had burned or been abandoned. Trading centers had lost distant partners. Letters from threatened cities reveal fear, urgency, and shrinking options. Grain shortages pressured kingdoms already burdened by war and tribute. Drought affected parts of the eastern Mediterranean, though not every place equally or simultaneously. Ships that once carried copper, tin, luxury goods, diplomats, and royal gifts could also carry armed men, refugees, or communities seeking new ground. The same routes that created prosperity could spread disruption when several parts of the system failed together. Ramesses III's victory cannot be understood as an isolated duel between Egypt and mysterious outsiders. The battle belongs to a larger collapse, but it does not explain that collapse by itself. The people shown falling from ships may have been attackers, migrants, hired fighters, survivors of ruined states, or some combination. No single explanation fully accounts for their movement, nor can one inscription tell us whether every group travelled together, whether all fought in the same place, or whether artists assembled separate episodes into one statement. Still, something happened that Egypt considered important enough to monumentalize on an extraordinary scale. Forces approached its sphere of control. Ramesses mobilized. Fighting occurred on land and water. Captives were taken. The court proclaimed that the invasion had been stopped. Egypt remained standing while other powers disappeared from the political map. That survival was real, even if the triumph was less complete than the walls suggest. The stone ships at Medinet Habu are both evidence and warning. They invite reconstruction, but resist certainty. They preserve the moment when Egypt imagined itself as the final barrier against a world coming apart. To understand why those ships reach the river mouths, the story must leave the temple and travel backward into the system that made them possible, a brilliant network of kingdoms, ports, roads, palaces, and obligations so interconnected that its greatest strength became one of its deepest vulnerabilities. Long before those carved ships crowded the river mouths, the eastern Mediterranean had been held together by movement. Copper crossed the sea from Cyprus. Tin arrived through longer chains, perhaps from Central Asia or lands farther east, passing through many hands before it reached workshops that turned copper into bronze. Grain moved from fertile regions towards cities that could not reliably feed themselves. Timber came from the Levant. Horses, chariots, ivory, glass, textiles, oil, wine, incense, and prestige objects circulated between courts whose rulers addressed one another as brothers, rivals, and partners in a diplomatic world larger than any single kingdom. This was not a landscape of isolated peoples occasionally meeting at the edge of the sea. By the 13th century BC, Egypt, Hatti, Babylonia, Assyria, Cyprus, the cities of Syria, and the palace centres of the Aegean belonged to overlapping systems of exchange. Royal marriages carried political meaning across enormous distances. Messengers crossed borders with tablets, gifts, complaints, and demands. Merchants moved under the protection of treaties and officials. Ports received ships whose cargoes combined raw materials from several regions. A bronze sword made in one place might depend on copper mined in another, tin obtained through an uncertain eastern route, charcoal produced locally, and a palace administration capable of gathering workers, food, and fuel. The system was impressive precisely because no kingdom possessed everything it needed. Egypt controlled agricultural wealth and gold from Nubia, but it relied on foreign timber and imported metals. The Hittite state governed Anatolia and northern Syria. Yet some core regions were vulnerable to poor harvests. Ugarit flourished because it stood between inland kingdoms and the Mediterranean, but its prosperity depended on remaining connected to both. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece accumulated goods through taxation and redistribution, while their elites demanded metals and luxuries from beyond the Aegean. Cyprus supplied copper on a scale linking mines, settlements, ports, and foreign buyers. Such interdependence created wealth, but also exposure. A missed harvest in one region might be answered by importing grain from another. A local war could be survived if alternative ports remained open. A damaged fleet might be replaced if shipyards, timber, labour, and credit still functioned elsewhere. The network possessed resilience when disruption remained limited. Trouble became more dangerous when several failures overlapped. If harvest declined while armies demanded supplies, if ports were attacked while trade routes shifted, if royal courts raised tribute as revenues fell, then the mechanisms designed to stabilize the system could intensify its weakness. Palatial economies were especially dependent on coordination. Officials recorded deliveries, assigned labor, stored grain, equipped forces, and rewarded specialists. These institutions could mobilize resources on a scale beyond most villages, but their complexity required constant flows of information and goods. When the palace functioned, it could feed artisans who did not farm, support chariot forces, commission temples, and receive imported metal. When the palace failed, the people beneath it did not necessarily vanish, but the networks connecting them could change abruptly. Workshops lost patrons, scribes lost administrative roles, soldiers went unpaid or attached themselves to new leaders, merchants sought safer harbours, communities turned toward local survival. This distinction matters because the end of the Bronze Age was not the disappearance of everyone who lived within it. Later generations inherited many of the same landscapes, crops, languages, and craft traditions. What collapsed most dramatically were political systems, palace administrations, and long-distance relationships that had concentrated power in a narrow group of centres. For rulers, the loss could look like the end of the world. For farmers, fishermen, herders, and village craftsmen, it might mean danger, displacement, heavier burdens, or difficult reorganization rather than extinction. The sea itself was neither simply a highway nor simply a barrier. It could deliver grain to a hungry coast and armed crews to an unprepared harbour. The same maritime knowledge used by traders and palace fleets could be used by raiders, mercenaries, or displaced seafarers. Ships did not announce the category of the people aboard them. A vessel might carry merchants in one season, soldiers in another, and families seeking resettlement after political breakdown. Modern labels divide migration, trade, piracy, and warfare more cleanly than ancient circumstances may have allowed. The cargo recovered from the Ulubaran shipwreck, lost off southern Anatolia roughly a century before Ramesses III, offers a striking image of this interconnected world. Its load included copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, resin, luxury objects, foodstuffs, and materials linked to widely separated regions. The ship was not a miniature of every Bronze Age voyage, but it demonstrates how many communities could contribute to one cargo. Even the familiar oxhide-shaped copper ingots were designed to be moved, stacked, and transferred through human chains. Prosperity rested on repeated acts of transport, trust, accounting, and protection. What survives in the record suggests that these routes were under pressure before the crisis reached Egypt. Letters from royal archives contain requests for grain, military assistance, ships, and reassurance. Some rulers insisted that obligations be fulfilled even as their partners faced danger. Tribute and taxation did not automatically ease during scarcity. Powerful states often tried to preserve themselves by extracting more from dependent territories. That response could strengthen the centre briefly while weakening the provinces expected to supply it. There was no single moment when every route closed. Some cities continued trading after others were destroyed. Some ports changed hands. Some settlements expanded as older capitals declined. Regional exchange survived even when long-distance palace commerce contracted. Scholars still debate the sequence because destruction layers, abandoned buildings, imported pottery, written archives, and radiocarbon chronologies do not align into one universal date. The transition unfolded unevenly, with sudden disasters in some places and slower transformations in others. This unevenness makes the wider collapse more unsettling, not less. A system does not need to fail everywhere at once to become unreliable everywhere. Merchants alter plans when news of danger spreads. Rulers hoard resources when allies seem weak. Communities leave exposed settlements before an enemy arrives. Prices rise when ships fail to appear. Armed groups grow when regular employment disappears. A disruption in one part of the network changes decisions in another, and those decisions create new disruptions. By the time Ramesses III faced the forces later grouped as sea peoples, the Eastern Mediterranean was no longer the stable diplomatic arena known to earlier pharaohs. It was a landscape of broken promises, uncertain harvests, weakened courts, mobile warriors, and communities searching for protection. The ships approaching Egypt did not emerge from empty water. They came along routes built by centuries of prosperity, using the maritime world that kingdoms themselves had created. To understand why Egypt became their destination, the story must turn toward the kingdom waiting at the southern edge of that collapsing network, still wealthy, still formidable, but no longer protected by the old order beyond its borders. Egypt enters the reign of Ramesses III, carrying the appearance of strength and the memory of greater days. The Nile still floods, temples still receive offerings, gold still comes north from Nubia, grain still fills state granaries, and royal workshops still produce the objects of kingship. To foreign observers, the country remains one of the richest powers in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet beneath that surface lies a state under strain, governed by a dynasty that has inherited the institutions of empire without fully inheriting the security that once sustained them. The long shadow belongs to Ramesses II. His reign had lasted for more than 6 decades, filling Egypt with colossal statues, monumental inscriptions, temples, and memories of military glory. His image was so powerful that later rulers repeatedly borrowed from it. His name remained attached to cities, sanctuaries, and a vision of kingship that seemed almost impossible to equal. But longevity had consequences. By the time Ramesses II died, succession passed through an aging royal family, and the rapid reigns that followed weakened continuity. Meneptah, his son and successor, defended Egypt against a major Libyan coalition that included several groups later associated with the Sea Peoples. After Meneptah, court conflict and short reigns disturbed the final years of the 19th dynasty. The transition was not a neat handover from one stable house to another. Competing claims, powerful officials, and uncertain succession shaped the period. A court figure named Bey rose to exceptional prominence before disappearing from the record, while the reigns of Seti II, Siptah, and the female ruler Tusret reflected a kingdom whose royal centre no longer projected the effortless confidence of earlier generations. Egyptian texts later portrayed the closing phase as disorder, though such descriptions must be read cautiously because new dynasties often magnified the chaos that preceded them. Still, the political disruption was real enough to leave the throne vulnerable. The founder of the 20th dynasty, Setnagt, appears to have restored control by force and by presenting himself as the man who ended confusion. His reign was brief. Ramesses III, probably his son, inherited the throne around 1186 BC and immediately adopted a royal identity modelled on Ramesses II. The choice was deliberate. His throne names, artistic programs, and monumental language linked him to the most celebrated ruler of the previous dynasty. In an age of uncertainty, imitation was not mere vanity. It was a claim that the old order had returned. Yet the world surrounding Egypt had changed. The Hittite Empire, once Egypt's great rival and later its treaty partner, was weakening. Political instability spread through Syria and Anatolia. Maritime routes were becoming less predictable. Libyan groups remained a serious threat along Egypt's western approaches. Nubia to the south still supplied wealth, but holding imperial territories and maintaining garrisons demanded resources. The royal court had to fund temples, bureaucracies, military forces, construction projects, and an elite system built during centuries of expansion. Ramesses III therefore faced a contradiction. He needed to appear as a universal king at precisely the moment when the material foundations of universal kingship were becoming harder to sustain. His temple at Medinet Habu would eventually display abundance, victory, and divine favour on a monumental scale. The state behind those images was still capable of extraordinary organisation. It could summon troops, equip ships, move food, record captives, and construct one of the best preserved royal temples in Egypt. But capability should not be confused with unlimited strength. The first years of the reign were devoted to consolidation and preparation. Ramesses III maintained the traditional machinery of kingship ceremonies, temple patronage, appointments, taxation, and military readiness. He presented himself as chosen by the gods and as the protector who restored proper boundaries. What survives in official inscriptions emphasizes calm authority. The silences are equally important. Royal texts rarely describe budget shortages, rivalry among officials, local resistance, or the cost of mobilization. They show the result the palace wished to preserve, not every pressure experienced by the people who supplied it. The Great Harris Papyrus, compiled after Ramesses III's death, offers the fullest royal summary of his achievements. It lists gifts to temples, estates, personnel, expeditions, campaigns, and acts of restoration. Its scale conveys enormous wealth. Yet it is a commemorative document created at the beginning of Ramesses III's reign, intended to honor the dead king and legitimize his successor. It tells us how the dynasty wanted the reign remembered. It cannot be treated as an audited account of Egyptian power. Even so, the document reveals a ruler deeply invested in temples. Vast donations to Amun-Ra, Ptah, and other cults strengthened divine institutions and bound priesthoods to the crown. This policy supported royal legitimacy, but it also transferred land, labor, and production into temple domains. Over time, large religious estates could become power centers whose interests did not always align perfectly with the palace. The later weakening of royal authority did not begin with one donation or one reign, but the balance between crown, temples, and administration was already changing. Egypt's population still depended on the regular rhythms of the Nile, and the state's ability to collect and redistribute grain remained central to political stability. Harvest variation, corruption, delayed rations, and the cost of war could all disturb that system. The famous workers' strike at Deir el-Medina would come later in Ramesses III's reign, when rations for the royal tomb builders failed to arrive on time. That event belongs to the aftermath of the wars, but its possibility is already present in the structure of the kingdom, a wealthy state whose obligations were growing faster than its security. Ramesses III did not take power over a ruined Egypt. He ruled a formidable country with functioning institutions, experienced soldiers, skilled officials, and immense symbolic authority. This is precisely why his later victories were possible. But he also inherited a state that had to defend longer borders, replace lost partners, manage ambitious temples, and maintain the image of empire as the international system beyond Egypt began to contract. The royal residence in the eastern delta also placed the court close to the routes from Sinai and the Levant. That geography sharpened both opportunity and danger. Reports, merchants, troops, and refugees could arrive through the same frontier corridors, making distant upheaval increasingly difficult to ignore. The danger first appeared most clearly from the west. In the 5th year of his reign, Libyan forces and their allies moved against Egypt, repeating a pattern already visible under Merneptah. The coming campaign would test whether Ramesses III's carefully constructed identity as a new Ramesses the Great could survive contact with a harsher reality. Before the famous ships entered the river mouths, Egypt's king would have to prove himself on land against enemies who knew that the Nile Valley remained the richest prize in a region growing poorer. Before the western frontier erupts, one problem of language has to be cleared away, because the name most often attached to the coming crisis did not exist in the form modern audiences know. Sea Peoples is a convenient label created by scholars for several groups named in Egyptian records of the late 19th and early 20th dynasties. It sounds ancient, unified, and self-explanatory. In reality, it is none of those things. No surviving inscription records a great confederation introducing itself by that title. No treaty lists its common leaders. No archive reveals a shared homeland, a collective political program, or a single command stretching across the Mediterranean. The phrase gathers fragments together after the fact, and in doing so, it can create the very unity historians are trying to prove. Egyptian texts name individual groups. Under Ramesses III, the most famous list includes the Peleset, Tjeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh. Other names appear in earlier and related records, including the Shurden, Luka, Ekwesh, and Teresh. Some were already known to Egypt before the great battles of Ramesses III. Shurden warriors, for example, could serve as enemies in one context and as soldiers within Egyptian forces in another. That alone warns against imagining fixed ethnic blocks moving through history with one permanent role. A man identified by a foreign name might be a raider, mercenary, captive, settler, or royal guardsman at different moments in his life. The Egyptians themselves did not classify all these people in a single modern category. They described foreign lands, islanders, northerners, enemies, and peoples associated with the sea, but the terminology shifts according to text, period, and political purpose. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu turn distinct names into a collective threat, because a collective threat magnifies the king's achievement. Royal ideology prefers a world divided cleanly between Egypt and disorder. Human movement is rarely so tidy. Even the word people can mislead. It suggests an entire society with a stable territory, language, and government. Yet some named groups may have been communities in that sense, while others may have been military followings, maritime coalitions, displaced households, or labels applied by outsiders to mixed bodies of men. Urosh Matic has drawn attention to the Egyptian titles used for their leaders. They are not always described with the same language applied to great foreign kings. This may suggest smaller-scale chiefs, war leaders, or commanders whose authority rested on mobile groups rather than established states. The evidence remains incomplete, but it weakens the popular picture of a single migrating empire. The reliefs add another layer of apparent certainty. Artists distinguish some enemies through feathered headgear, horned helmets, round shields, clothing, facial hair, and weapons. These visual differences are valuable, but Egyptian art followed conventions. Costume could communicate foreign identity, status, or category, rather than record every individual exactly as he appeared. The same visual type might be repeated because it was recognizable to an Egyptian audience. A headdress carved on a temple wall is evidence, but it is not a passport. Attempts to match the names with later peoples have produced both persuasive possibilities and long arguments. Peleset are often connected with the Philistines of the southern Levant. Denyen have been linked to several groups, including populations remembered in Aegean or Anatolian traditions. Shekelesh have sometimes been associated with Sicily, and Shurden with Sardinia. Tjeker have been placed along the Levantine coast, while Weshesh remain especially obscure. Similarities in sound are tempting, particularly when geography seems to cooperate, but names can travel, change, or be rendered imperfectly by foreign scribes. A resemblance does not establish a homeland. The modern label also encourages a dramatic map arrows descending from the Aegean, sweeping through Anatolia and Syria, destroying cities in sequence and finally striking Egypt. Such maps are memorable because they turn a complex century into one campaign. Yet archaeology does not reveal a single trail of identical destruction. Some sites burn, some are abandoned, some shrink, some recover, and others grow. Destruction dates differ. Local conflicts matter. Earthquakes, internal rebellion, dynastic weakness, famine, and opportunistic warfare leave overlapping traces. Mobile groups were certainly part of this world, but the evidence does not show one army methodically erasing every kingdom from west to east. Migration itself should not be confused automatically with invasion. The Medinet Habu reliefs include carts and figures that have often been interpreted as families travelling with warriors. That image has supported the idea of whole populations on the move. It may preserve a genuine element of migration, but its meaning is debated, and the scenes are part of a royal composition. People could move because they were attacking, because they had been expelled, because trade had failed, because harvests had collapsed, or because stronger powers recruited them. Several motives could exist within the same group. The term remains useful when handled carefully. It allows historians to discuss a cluster of Egyptian references connected to the upheavals around 1200 BC. It becomes dangerous only when convenience hardens into identity. Saying the Sea Peoples attacked can conceal the fact that different named groups may have acted at different times, in different places, and under different circumstances. It can also make the victims of collapse appear passive, as though destruction arrived entirely from outside a healthy system. The Eastern Mediterranean was already under strain, and many of the people later labelled as invaders may have emerged from within that same collapsing network. Egyptian propaganda had reasons to simplify. A king defending the cosmic order does not benefit from explaining that enemies may once have traded with Egyptian ports, served in foreign armies, or fled shortages created by imperial politics. Ambiguity weakens the moral geometry of victory. On temple walls, the foreigner becomes visible, named, defeated, and counted. The king becomes the fixed centre around which disorder is arranged. What survives, then, is a paradox. The Egyptian records are indispensable because without them several groups might be almost unknown. Yet the records also force those groups into an Egyptian story. Their names reach us through the language of the state that defeated or captured them. Their intentions remain largely silent. Scholars still debate whether some names describe ethnic communities, geographic origins, political affiliations, or military identities. No single explanation fully accounts for all of them. That uncertainty should remain present as the story returns to Ramesses III's frontier. The forces moving around Egypt were not a faceless tide from an unknown ocean. They were separate groups with different histories, some familiar to Egyptian officials and some newly prominent. The phrase Sea Peoples will remain useful, but only as a modern umbrella held above a gathering storm. Beneath it stand people whose origins, alliances, and motives were far less unified than the stone walls of Medinet Habu would have future generations believe. The warning signs had appeared before Ramesses III ever took the throne. Egypt's encounter with mobile maritime groups did not begin suddenly in his 8th regnal year, and the names later gathered beneath the modern label Sea Peoples had already entered Egyptian records under earlier kings. The most important precedent comes from the reign of Merneptah, son and successor of Ramesses III. When a Libyan coalition advanced toward the Western Delta and brought with it several foreign contingents whose identities remain debated, Merneptah inherited an empire made impressive by his father's long reign, but also a kingdom forced to defend the edges of that inheritance. In his 5th year, around 1208 BC, Libyan forces under a leader usually identified as Merie moved eastward with allies named in Egyptian inscriptions as Sherdun, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, and Teresh. Some of those names reappear, directly or indirectly, in later discussions of the Sea Peoples. Their presence reveals that armed groups moving through the central and eastern Mediterranean were already participating in conflicts around Egypt decades before Ramesses III carved his own victories at Medinet Habu. The coalition was not described as a simple naval invasion. Its core was Libyan, approaching from the west. While the foreign contingents may have served as allies, mercenaries, migrant warriors, or independent bands attached to a larger opportunity, Egyptian texts portray the enemy as a dangerous mass threatening the cultivated land of the Delta. Yet, as always, the language belongs to a royal victory account. The court's purpose was not to explain the internal structure of the coalition. It was to show Meneptah as the ruler who had saved Egypt from disorder. The campaign ended in a major Egyptian victory. Inscriptions describe thousands of enemies killed or captured and list grim forms of battlefield accounting intended to prove the scale of defeat. The numbers are difficult to verify, and royal totals should not be accepted without caution. What matters more is that the state treated the threat as serious enough to commemorate repeatedly. Meneptah's forces mobilized successfully. The western approach was secured, and the pharaoh presented himself as the defender of the Nile Valley. The event created a political template that Ramesses III would later inherit. Foreign groups gather at Egypt's margins. The king responds decisively, and victory becomes evidence that divine order remains intact. This earlier conflict also complicates any attempt to assign the named groups permanent roles. The Shurden, for example, had appeared in Egyptian service as elite soldiers and bodyguards, recognizable in art by horned helmets and round shields. They could fight for Egypt, against Egypt, or perhaps for whichever ruler offered employment and protection. The Luka were associated in some text with southwestern Anatolia and were known within the wider Late Bronze Age world. The Shekelesh reappear under Ramesses III. The Ekwesh and Teresh have inspired proposed links to Aegean or Western Mediterranean populations, but none of these identifications is certain enough to transform resemblance into fact. Even before Meneptah, foreign seafarers had entered Egypt's military imagination. Ramesses II's records associated Shurden fighters with both hostility and royal service, and Egyptian armies routinely absorbed men taken or recruited from abroad. This longer background matters because it replaces the image of unknown invaders suddenly appearing at the end of the age. Some of the communities later treated as enemies had already been visible within Egyptian warfare for generations, known not only by rumour but through direct contact. Their mobility reflects the character of the age. The Eastern Mediterranean had long depended on warriors who crossed political boundaries. Great kings exchanged military support, hired foreigners, resettled captives, and incorporated outsiders into their armies. Maritime skill could be converted quickly from trade to raiding or military service. A group appearing as an enemy in one royal inscription might already have spent years within the networks of states it later attacked. The distinction between outsider and participant was often much thinner than royal art suggests. Meneptah's reign provides another famous inscription, the victory stela that includes the earliest widely accepted Egyptian reference to Israel. That text celebrates campaigns in Canaan and Libya in sweeping language, announcing that foreign lands have been subdued and their resistance extinguished. It is useful not because every line can be read literally, but because it shows how Egyptian kings compressed complicated military activity into a universal declaration of peace restored by conquest. Ramesses III's later inscriptions belong to the same ideological tradition. His language would appear more dramatic because the crisis was deeper, but the grammar of royal triumph was already established. The years between Meneptah's victory and Ramesses III's accession were marked by political turbulence inside Egypt and growing instability beyond it. Short reigns followed. Authority shifted among competing figures. The 19th dynasty ended without the confidence of its beginning. At the same time, the international system was deteriorating. Ugarit still corresponded with Hittite rulers, but its position grew increasingly exposed. Anatolia faced severe pressure. Maritime security weakened. Armed groups could move through spaces where royal control had become uncertain. This does not mean a single coalition from Meneptah's time simply waited and returned under Ramesses III. Decades separated the campaigns, and the composition of the forces changed. Some names disappeared, others returned, and new names became prominent. What survives in the record suggests recurring patterns rather than one continuous army Libyan expansion toward the Delta, foreign warriors joining regional conflicts, and Egypt repeatedly absorbing shocks generated beyond its frontiers. There were warnings from farther north as well. Egyptian officials knew that the Levant was not an empty buffer. It contained ports, vassal territories, trade routes, garrisons, and communities tied to Egypt through tribute and diplomacy. Disturbances there threatened access to timber, metals, and strategic corridors. The weakening of Hittite authority created opportunities for local rivals and mobile forces. News could travel through merchants, envoys, fugitives, and military reports long before an army reached Egyptian soil. Ramesses III's court therefore faced the coming crisis with some institutional memory. Egypt had records of earlier coalitions, experienced commanders, and established methods for mobilizing troops along threatened borders. Yet experience could also create false confidence. Merneptah had defeated his enemies in a conventional land campaign and preserved the Delta. Ramesses III would soon confront a broader combination of threats: Libyan pressure in his 5th year, followed by the famous conflicts of his 8th. The names carved later at Medinet Habu would seem new to modern eyes, but to Egyptian scribes the pattern was recognizable. Foreign groups were gathering around weakened states, attaching themselves to larger movements, and testing the richest surviving kingdom on the southern edge of the Mediterranean. The warning had already been written in stone before Ramesses III became king. Egypt had survived once, but survival did not remove the causes of danger. It merely postponed the next encounter. The crisis that would eventually reach Egypt first became visible farther north, in places whose prosperity depended on the routes now beginning to fail. Along the Syrian coast, in central Anatolia, on Cyprus, and across the Aegean, the political map still appeared familiar. Palaces stood, archives functioned, and rulers issued commands. Yet the documents left by those states reveal a system losing its margin for error. Requests became more urgent. Supplies became harder to secure. Enemies appeared where merchants had once been expected. The collapse did not begin with one final blow. It began with institutions discovering that they could no longer solve several problems at once. Ugarit offers the clearest view because its destruction preserved the records of a city caught in the last stage of crisis. Located on the coast of northern Syria, Ugarit was a wealthy kingdom tied to the Hittite Empire and connected by sea to Cyprus, the Aegean, Egypt, and the Levant. Its scribes wrote in several languages, its merchants handled international cargoes, its court exchanged letters with kings and officials across the region. It was one of the sophisticated centers that made the late Bronze Age system work. The tablets found in its ruins are often read like messages from a world ending in real time. Some refer to enemy ships, missing troops, exposed territory, and requests for help. One famous letter explains that the king's own ships and forces were away when hostile vessels appeared. Another communication asks about the location of enemy ships and the condition of neighbouring lands. These texts are fragmentary, and scholars still debate their exact sequence and whether every letter belongs to the final days of the city. Even so, they preserve a striking fact: Ugarit's rulers understood that danger was moving through the maritime network, but their military resources were dispersed by obligations to larger powers. That weakness was built into the imperial order. Ugarit was prosperous, but it was not fully independent. The Hittite court could demand troops, ships, grain, and loyalty. In stable times, subordination provided protection and access to a broad political system. In crisis, the same obligations could strip a vulnerable kingdom of what it needed for its own defense. Research on grain tribute in Hittite Syria suggests imperial demands may have intensified shortages in regions already under pressure. A palace could obey the empire and thereby weaken the communities expected to sustain it. Farther north, the Hittite state faced its own convergence of problems. Its core territories in Anatolia depended on variable harvests and complex supply arrangements. Tree ring evidence points to a particularly severe multi-year drought around the end of the 13th century BC, close to the period when Hittite central authority disappeared. 3 consecutive years of extreme dryness would have placed extraordinary pressure on food production, transport, and political legitimacy. Yet drought alone does not explain the fall. The Hittite world also faced warfare, succession tensions, regional rebellion, disrupted trade, and the enormous cost of maintaining an empire across difficult terrain. The capital at Hattusa was eventually abandoned and partly burned, but even this famous destruction resists a simple story. Some parts of the city may have been evacuated before fire reached them. Administrative activity appears to have declined unevenly. The end of the empire was not necessarily a single siege in which an unknown army destroyed everything in one night. What vanished was the central structure capable of coordinating provinces, armies, taxation, diplomacy, and grain movement. Hittite cultural traditions survived in successor states farther south, but the great imperial court no longer governed the network that had once balanced Egypt in the north. Cyprus also changed under pressure. Its copper resources made it indispensable to bronze production, and its ports connected several regions. Archaeological evidence shows destruction and rebuilding at some sites, continuity at others, and changes in settlement patterns and material culture. New populations may have arrived, but local communities also adapted. The island did not disappear beneath an invasion. It became one of the places where movement, conflict, trade disruption, and cultural mixing occurred together. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean palace system fractured. Major centres such as Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns experienced destruction, contraction, or reorganization within a broader period of instability. Linear B administration disappeared when the palaces that supported its scribes failed. Yet people remained in Greece, and some communities continued for generations. The collapse of palatial bureaucracy was profound, but it was not the extinction of Aegean society. Local survival continued beneath the ruins of elite institutions. This pattern repeated across the eastern Mediterranean. A city could burn without an entire region becoming empty. A dynasty could vanish while farmers remained on the land. Imported pottery might decline while local production expanded. Populations could move into abandoned spaces or gather around smaller fortified settlements. The word collapse captures the scale of institutional loss, but it can conceal the varied experiences beneath it. The failures also interacted. When Hittite authority weakened, dependent cities lost protection. When Ugarit or another port ceased functioning, merchants and rulers lost access to shipping, information, and imported goods. When copper or tin routes became unreliable, weapon and tool production faced new constraints. When grain shortages deepened, states demanded more from subjects who had less to give. When soldiers were not paid or communities were displaced, armed mobility increased. Each disruption altered the behavior of neighboring societies, creating further stress. Network studies help explain why the process could appear sudden, even when its causes accumulated slowly. A highly connected system can absorb the loss of one center by redirecting goods through another. It becomes fragile when several hubs fail within a short period. Routes that once provided alternatives disappear together. The remaining centers become overloaded. Trust breaks down. States hoard supplies. Merchants avoid dangerous waters, and local leaders act independently. The network does not collapse because one city falls. Many cities fall because the network can no longer compensate for repeated shocks. By the early years of Ramesses III, Egypt looked southward from a world that had already begun to lose its northern anchors. Ugarit was doomed or gone. Hittite central power was collapsing. Aegean palaces were failing. Cyprus was transforming. The old diplomatic map still survived in memory, but fewer rulers remained capable of enforcing it. Into the spaces between broken states moved warriors, sailors, migrants, fugitives, and ambitious local leaders. Some may later appear among the names carved at Medinet Habu. The approaching conflict was therefore not the beginning of the Eastern Mediterranean crisis, it was one of its consequences. Egypt would face people shaped by a system that had first connected their worlds and then failed to protect them. Before they reached the Delta, drought, tribute, war, and broken trade had already turned the sea from a corridor of wealth into a route of uncertainty. The sea had become uncertain because the land was under pressure. Across parts of the eastern Mediterranean, rainfall declined, harvests failed, and the old systems for moving grain became less reliable, just when rulers needed them most. Climate did not act like an invading army, and it did not strike every coastline with equal force. Its effects were uneven, cumulative, and filtered through politics. A dry year could be endured. Several poor years, combined with war, taxation, disrupted shipping, and weak leadership, could push a state beyond recovery. Recent climate research has strengthened the case that the end of the Bronze Age unfolded during a prolonged period of environmental stress. Pollen records from the southern Levant indicate a long, dry phase extending across much of the transition into the Iron Age. Tree ring evidence from central Anatolia identifies an especially severe sequence of drought years near the final collapse of Hittite central power. Broader studies of Mediterranean climate suggest that long-term drying could become more destructive when several oceanic and atmospheric patterns aligned. None of this proves that climate caused the sea peoples, or that one drought destroyed every kingdom. It shows that the political crisis developed in a world where food security was becoming harder to maintain. Agriculture in the late Bronze Age depended on local rainfall in many regions beyond Egypt. Anatolia, inland Syria, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean could not rely on the Nile's regular inundation. Their harvest varied with winter rains, soil conditions, storage capacity, labor, and access to alternative supplies. A palace with full granaries might survive one failure by rationing food or importing grain. A dependent city with depleted stores and heavy tribute obligations had fewer options. When several regions suffered at once, the grain that normally moved towards scarcity might no longer exist in sufficient quantity. Egypt stood apart in one important respect. Its food system rested on the Nile, whose flood transformed desert margins into cultivable land. That did not make Egypt immune to shortage, but it gave the kingdom an agricultural base more reliable than many rain-fed neighbours possessed. In a hungry eastern Mediterranean, the Nile Valley became even more attractive. Egypt was not simply a rich kingdom. It was a visible concentration of grain, water, livestock, employment, and political order at the edge of a destabilized world. The attraction must be handled carefully. It does not follow that every group moving toward Egypt was starving, or that famine alone explains military action. Some may have sought land, some plunder, some service, and others political advantage. Warriors could exploit the weakness of communities already displaced by hunger. Migrants could travel with armed protection because unarmed movement through collapsing territories was dangerous. A leader might promise followers access to fertile land while also negotiating, raiding, or fighting along the route. Human motives rarely separate into neat categories during systemic crisis. Imperial pressure intensified these choices. Great states responded to declining security by demanding more grain, troops, ships, and labor from their subjects. The Hittite court depended on Syrian territories to help feed armies and urban populations. If tribute continued during local shortages, the imperial center could preserve itself temporarily by transferring risk outward. Ugarit and neighboring kingdoms might be ordered to supply grain or naval support while their own reserves and defenses weakened. The system protected hierarchy before it protected resilience. Such extraction could produce a dangerous cycle. Reduced harvest led rulers to tighten control. Tighter control encouraged evasion, resentment, migration, or rebellion. Military campaigns then consumed more food and manpower, requiring further extraction. If merchants avoided unsafe routes, states lost customs revenue and imported supplies. Officials might respond by seizing local stocks, which damaged trust and drove more people outside palace authority. What began as environmental stress became political fragmentation. Letters from the final decades of the Bronze Age do not provide a complete meteorological record, but they reveal anxiety about grain, requests for shipments, complaints about obligations, and references to famine show that rulers treated food supply as a strategic matter. Grain was not merely sustenance. It paid workers, supported garrisons, fed palace dependents, and made military concentration possible. An army without food could not defend a city. A fleet without provisions could not patrol the coast. A king unable to distribute grain risked losing both authority and loyalty. The burden did not fall evenly. Elites could draw on stores, estates, and long-distance contacts unavailable to ordinary households. Rural communities carried taxes and labor demands while remaining exposed to local crop failure. Port cities might receive imported grain yet lose access suddenly when shipping stopped. Inland settlements might be isolated from both markets and royal relief. Collapse at the palace level could therefore be preceded by a quieter erosion in villages, where families reduced consumption, sold animals, abandoned fields, or moved toward more secure regions. No surviving source describes a single mass migration caused by one failed harvest. The evidence instead suggests repeated movement over years and across different routes. Some populations relocated within the same region, others crossed the sea. Some joined fortified centres, while others established smaller settlements beyond the reach of old administrations. Armed groups could recruit from people who had lost land, wages, or political protection. The identities later carved by Egyptian scribes may have formed partly through this process of movement and regrouping. The years around 1200 BC were also marked by warfare unrelated to climate. Rival kingdoms continued fighting over territory and succession. Local powers challenged weakened imperial authorities. Raiders attacked shipping and coastal settlements. Earthquakes affected some areas, though they cannot explain every destruction layer. Disease may have contributed, but evidence is limited. Each pressure operated within the others. Drought made war harder to sustain. War made food harder to produce, and broken trade made recovery harder after both. This interaction is why no single cause is enough. A drought does not burn a palace by itself. An enemy does not automatically destroy a society capable of rebuilding. Trade disruption is survivable if food, leadership, and security remain intact. The catastrophe emerged when these safeguards failed together. The old system had been designed to gather wealth efficiently, not necessarily to withstand many simultaneous shocks. By the time Ramesses III confronted his first major Libyan invasion in his 5th regnal year, Egypt faced more than an army at the western frontier. It faced the human consequences of a region becoming drier, poorer, and more violent. The attackers came through political spaces where authority had weakened and resources had become prizes. Their movement was not explained by climate alone, but climate had narrowed the choices available to rulers and communities alike. The next war would show how Egypt's grain, geography, and surviving institutions could still resist pressures that had already broken kingdoms to the north. By the time the crisis reached Ramesses III's 8th regnal year, Egyptian scribes had reduced a complicated human movement to a list of names: Peleset, Tjeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. 5 labels carved into a royal victory account, each distinct yet drawn into the same defeated procession. These names are among the most famous clues left by the end of the Bronze Age. They are also among the most dangerous, because a name can create the illusion that identity is already understood. The Peleset are the group most often linked to a people known from later sources, the Philistines of the southern Levant. The resemblance between the names is strong, and archaeology shows significant cultural change in cities such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath near the beginning of the Iron Age. New pottery styles, food practices, architectural forms, and other material traits reveal connections with the Aegean and wider Mediterranean. Ancient DNA from Ashkelon has added another piece of evidence. Individuals from the early Iron Age carried a component of ancestry related to populations farther west, probably somewhere in southern Europe or the Aegean sphere, before that signal became rapidly diluted through mixing with local Levantine communities. This supports migration, but not the simplest version of the story. It does not prove that every Peleset came from one island, that they arrived in a single fleet, or that Ramesses III personally resettled an entire defeated nation in Philistia. The genetic sample is limited to one city and one period. Material culture can spread through intermarriage, imitation, trade, and mixed communities as well as mass migration. What survives suggests that newcomers entered the southern Levant and quickly became part of a population that was already there. Philistine identity, as later known, may have formed locally from several streams rather than arriving complete from overseas. The Tjeker are more elusive. Later Egyptian evidence has been used to place a group with a similar name at Dor on the central Levantine coast. This has encouraged reconstructions in which Tjeker survivors settled north of the emerging Philistine cities. Yet the path from a name at Medinet Habu to a specific archaeological population remains uncertain. Dor shows continuity, exchange, and transformation, but no object identifies its owner as Tjeker. The connection is possible, not proven. The Shekelesh had appeared earlier among the foreign allies fighting beside Libyans under Merneptah. Their name has often been connected to Sicily, especially because of its resemblance to the seagulls known from later classical traditions. The proposal is attractive, and movements between the central and eastern Mediterranean were certainly possible. But sound similarity across languages and centuries is not enough to establish a homeland. Egyptian scribes rendered unfamiliar names through their own writing system, without vowels recorded in modern form. A name that looks obvious on paper may hide several ancient pronunciations. The Denyen have generated an even wider field of possibilities. Some scholars have linked them to the Danans, a poetic name for Greeks in later epic tradition. Others have looked towards Cilicia in southern Anatolia, where later records mention a land and people with a comparable name. Connections have also been proposed with communities involved in the formation of Iron Age kingdoms in the northern Levant. Each possibility captures part of the evidence, but none resolves it. The Denyen may have included people from an Aegean background, an Anatolian setting, or a mixed maritime zone where identities crossed the categories modern maps prefer. The Weshesh remain the deepest mystery among the five. Proposed identifications range from western Anatolia to Aegean islands and beyond, but the evidence is too thin to support confidence. They appear prominently because Egypt names them, not because archaeology has traced a secure trail back to their homeland. In the silence around them, speculation easily expands. The conclusion is less satisfying, but more accurate. The Weshesh were real enough to matter to Ramesses III's scribes, yet their origin and later fate remain unknown. Even where a geographic connection appears plausible, the relationship between place and identity may not have been simple. A warrior could be named for a homeland he had left years earlier. A group could absorb outsiders while keeping an older label. A leader's following might contain sailors, mercenaries, displaced farmers, and families from several regions. Political names can survive migrations and change meaning. The people Egypt called Peleset, or Denyen, may not have defined themselves in exactly the same way, and those labels may have shifted as coalitions formed and dissolved. The reliefs seem to offer physical confirmation. Some enemies wear tall feathered headdresses and short kilts. Others carry round shields or use different equipment. Egyptian artists clearly wished to distinguish categories, but their visual language was selective. Repeated costumes made foreign groups recognizable within a monumental program. They may preserve genuine differences in clothing and military practice, yet they do not provide realistic portraits of every participant. The same image could combine observation, artistic convention, and political symbolism. Nor is it certain that all five groups fought together in one tightly organized coalition. The inscriptions present them as lands or peoples whose movement had overwhelmed other regions before Egypt stopped them. But the scenes may combine different engagements, and the list may arrange enemies according to ideological or compositional needs. Scholars still debate whether the land battle and naval battle represent one campaign, separate episodes, or an artistic synthesis of events occurring across a broader theatre. The carts shown with some enemy forces have often been interpreted as evidence that whole populations were migrating. They appear to carry possessions and non-combatants, suggesting movement beyond a temporary raid. That interpretation is reasonable, but the scene should not be treated as a census. Royal art could emphasize the completeness of victory by showing an enemy's entire social world captured at once. Even if families were present, their inclusion does not reveal why they moved or whether every named group travelled in the same manner. What these 5 names ultimately preserve is not a solved ethnic map, but a moment of reorganization. Populations were moving through lands where states had weakened. Old military labour markets were breaking apart. Coastal communities were becoming both refuges and targets. Some migrants entered local societies, some served new rulers, and some fought Egypt. Their identities were likely forged as much by the crisis as inherited from before it. Ramesses III's court transformed that uncertainty into a clear list because lists are instruments of power. To name an enemy is to contain him within the king's record. Peleset, Tjeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh entered history as defeated categories beneath Egyptian authority. Behind each word stood lives that the monument does not explain. Ahead lay the battles that made those names famous. First on land, then among the waterways where Egypt intended to ensure that mobility ended in a trap. The land battle begins before the ships reach the river mouths. In a landscape the reliefs make appear almost unnaturally clear. Ramesses III stands in his chariot, bow drawn, while enemy warriors collapse beneath Egyptian attack. Behind the fighting, carts carry possessions and people through a zone of confusion. This scene has often been treated as the opening phase of one enormous invasion, with a migrating coalition advancing south through the Levant until Egypt stopped it at the frontier. Yet the closer the evidence is examined, the less certain that simple sequence becomes. The inscriptions associate the great conflict with Ramesses III's 8th regnal year. They describe foreign groups moving through lands that had already been broken, gathering strength as they advanced, and threatening Egypt from the north. They present the enemy as a force that had overwhelmed kingdoms before reaching Egyptian territory. But the text does not provide a modern campaign map, and the reliefs do not identify a securely excavated battlefield. Its uncertainty remains central to any responsible reconstruction. Some reconstructions place the fighting in southern Canaan or along Egypt's northeastern approaches, where routes from the Levant entered the Delta through Sinai. Others argue that the scenes may combine operations in several locations, including battles fought beyond Egypt's core frontier. Even the order of the images may reflect temple design and royal ideology, rather than strict chronology. What survives in the record suggests a real military campaign, but not a complete itinerary. Egypt's defensive geography shaped the confrontation. The eastern delta was protected not by one wall, but by a system of forts, canals, roads, marshes, and controlled crossings. Earlier pharaohs had developed the ways of Horus, a chain of fortified stations running from the delta towards southern Canaan. Ramesses III inherited this military infrastructure and appears to have used it to concentrate forces before the enemy could reach the Nile Valley's agricultural heart. The king's inscriptions emphasize preparation. He claims to have strengthened the frontier, assembled infantry and chariotry, and positioned troops where the approaching groups could be intercepted. An army advancing with carts, supplies, and mixed groups would be vulnerable on narrow roads and near fortified crossings. Egyptian commanders did not need to chase it across the Mediterranean. They needed to deny access to water, grain, and the routes leading into the delta. The enemy shown on land is not an undifferentiated crowd. Some men carry round shields and long spears, others wear distinctive feathered headgear. Their equipment suggests close combat, but the relief does not show a disciplined formation in the modern sense. Egyptian artists present them at the moment of defeat, broken apart by chariots and volleys. This visual disorder supports the king's claim that foreign chaos could not withstand Egyptian organization. It does not reveal how the battle began, how long it lasted, or whether the opposing forces had initially deployed effectively. Egyptian chariots occupy the visual center. In late Bronze Age warfare, chariots were mobile platforms for archers, symbols of elite status, and tools for pursuit and command. They were not simply heavy vehicles crashing into massed infantry on suitable ground. An Egyptian chariot team could approach, release arrows, turn, and strike again while maintaining distance. Against slower forces burdened by transport carts, this mobility could be decisive. Yet terrain mattered. Marshes, soft ground, and narrow passages could restrict chariots as easily as they restricted enemies. The relief therefore shows an ideal battlefield, open enough for royal movement and controlled enough for victory. Infantry would have carried much of the fighting. Archers could disrupt approaching formations, while spearmen and shield-bearers closed with opponents or secured captives. Egypt's army was itself ethnically varied, including Nubians, Libyans, Shurden, and other foreign soldiers alongside native troops. This is a revealing contradiction. The king's monument divides the world into Egypt and foreigners, but Egypt's military power depended partly on foreigners incorporated into its service. Identity on the battlefield followed allegiance as much as origin. The carts behind the enemy remain one of the scene's most unsettling details. They imply that movement involved more than raiding parties. Household goods, transport animals, and non-combatants may have accompanied at least some groups. The presence of such carts has encouraged the image of a migrating population seeking settlement. That may be partly correct, but royal imagery could also use captured carts to demonstrate total victory over an enemy community. The evidence does not reveal whether these people expected to conquer Egypt, negotiate entry, pass through its territory, or establish themselves in lands under Egyptian influence. Nor is it clear that every person in the moving population shared the same purpose. Armed leaders may have controlled followers with different motives. Some may have been displaced by destruction farther north. Others may have joined because movement offered access to food and protection. Experienced warriors could exploit larger migrations, while families relied on those warriors to survive. The categories of refugee, settler, mercenary, and invader could overlap within the same column. Ramesses III's account leaves no room for such ambiguity. The enemy had violated the proper order, and the king destroyed its plans. Captives are shown bound and counted. Enemy hands are recorded as proof of military success. This scene converts uncertain movement into a measurable victory. Numbers reinforce the image of overwhelming defeat, though royal totals cannot be independently verified. They express scale and control more reliably than arithmetic precision. The land battle also prepared the logic of the naval engagement. If enemy movement was divided between forces travelling overland and ships moving along the coast, Egypt's response had to coordinate both fronts. Stopping troops on the northeastern approaches prevented them from combining freely with maritime forces near the delta. Fortifications and chariot units could constrain movement on land, while boats and archers waited among the waterways. Whether these operations occurred simultaneously or were later woven together, the royal narrative presents them as one strategic achievement. What remains historically credible is not every pose carved into stone, but the broad outline beneath it. Egypt detected a serious threat, mobilized experienced forces, and fought a major engagement somewhere along its northern sphere. The approaching groups included warriors and probably wider migrating elements. Ramesses III's army prevented them from entering the Nile Valley in strength, yet the victory did not erase them. Some survived, some were captured, and others may have settled elsewhere in the Levant. The land had checked their advance, but the sea still offered another route. Along the eastern delta, channels, lagoons, and river mouths formed a maze that could carry ships toward Egypt's interior. There, the king's commanders prepared a different kind of battle, one in which open water would be narrowed, movement would become confusion, and the fleet approaching Egypt would discover that the river itself had been turned into a weapon. The water ahead of the Egyptian fleet is not the open Mediterranean. It is a confined world of channels, lagoons, reeds, and river mouths where ships can lose the freedom that makes them dangerous. Somewhere along Egypt's northeastern approaches, perhaps near the eastern delta or the waterways of northwest Sinai, Ramesses III's commanders prepare to meet vessels. The precise location remains uncertain, but the tactical logic preserved at Medinet Habu is unmistakable. The enemy is drawn into water where movement can be controlled. Archers can dominate the approaches, and escape becomes difficult. The relief shows ships locked together in confusion. Masts lean at opposing angles, hulls turn broadside. Men tumble over the rails or cling to vessels already losing order. Egyptian archers release volleys from ships and possibly from the shore, while infantry wait to seize survivors. The composition creates the impression of an ambush unfolding as planned. The enemy fleet enters, finds itself trapped, and is destroyed before it can land. Whether every stage occurred in this sequence cannot be proved, but the image preserves a credible principle of riverine warfare. A commander who controls the banks and channels can neutralize an opponent's advantages at sea. Egyptian ships were not strangers to river operations. The Nile had trained generations of sailors in current, wind, maneuver, transport, and coordinated movement. State expeditions crossed the Red Sea, fleets traveled to the Levant, and military vessels supported campaigns along the coast. Egypt's maritime power was often overshadowed by its chariots and land battles. Yet the kingdom possessed the resources to assemble crews, archers, marines, pilots, provisions, and repair materials. The vessels carved at Medinet Habu reveal enough detail to encourage reconstruction, but not enough to settle every question. They have single masts, rigging, steering oars, and high ends that make the opposing fleets visually similar. The difference lies less in ship type than in control. Egyptian vessels remain integrated into a tactical system. Their crews shoot, close, board, and coordinate with forces on land. The enemy ships appear compressed together, unable to deploy freely. Some may have been pulled or forced alongside Egyptian hulls. Others seem to capsize after losing balance or steering. One possibility is that Egyptian archers first weakened enemy crews from a distance. In narrow water, ships could not easily turn away or spread out to reduce exposure. Arrows fired from positions on shore may have added to those launched from decks. Once crews were disordered, Egyptian vessels could close for boarding while soldiers on the banks blocked landing points. The relief suggests ropes, grappling, or direct collision between hulls, but scholars still debate exactly how the ships were entangled. What survives in the carving is not a technical manual, it is a compressed image of tactical superiority. The absence of visible rams is significant. This was not a later Mediterranean battle in which warships struck one another below the waterline. Combat may have depended more on missiles, maneuver, boarding, and capturing vessels. Crews exposed above low rails were vulnerable to sustained archery. A ship whose helmsmen, officers, or rigging were disabled could become an obstacle to the vessels behind it. In a crowded channel, one drifting hull might disrupt an entire formation. Ramesses III's inscriptions declare that the enemy who entered the river mouths was caught as if in a net. The metaphor is powerful because it turns geography into royal strategy. The waters seem loyal to Egypt. Foreign ships that had crossed long distances are rendered helpless at the threshold of the Nile. The king claims to have prepared the defences in advance, stationing forces and organising the fleet before the enemy arrived. This may preserve planning, though the language also belongs to a tradition in which the pharaoh foresees danger and masters it through divine favour. The battle's location has inspired debate. Some scholars place it near a Peleset or other eastern branch of the Nile, while others propose lagoon systems and coastal waterways farther toward northwest Sinai. Ancient shorelines have changed, river branches have shifted, and sediment has transformed the delta since the 12th century BC. No securely identified wreck field or battlefield has confirmed the site. The phrase about the river mouths may refer to a broader defensive zone rather than one point on a modern map. This uncertainty matters because landscape shapes interpretation. An engagement in a broad river mouth might have allowed more maneuver than the relief suggests. A battle inside lagoons or narrow channels would make the apparent trap more plausible. Egyptian commanders familiar with local depths, currents, and passages could guide their own ships through routes dangerous to newcomers. Enemy vessels designed for coastal travel may have found shallow or restricted water difficult, especially if heavily loaded. The people aboard those ships are shown almost entirely as combatants, but their wider purpose remains unclear. They may have intended to support the overland movement already checked on Egypt's frontier. They may have sought to force entry into the delta, seize supplies, land migrants, or attack ports. The naval force may also have represented only part of a broader series of confrontations later combined by royal artists. No enemy account survives to explain the plan. The Egyptian victory appears real, but its scale is harder to measure. Ships were captured or disabled, men were killed or taken prisoner, and the attempted penetration of Egypt's waterways failed. Yet the inscriptions transform a successful defense into universal annihilation. The defeated are presented as though none escaped and no threat remained. Royal victory texts rarely preserve stalemate, confusion, Egyptian losses, or the possibility that some enemies withdrew. The monument's silence cannot prove those things occurred, but it warns against mistaking completeness of presentation for completeness of destruction. Captives taken after the battle entered another machinery of state power. They could be counted, displayed, assigned to temples, incorporated into labor forces, or recruited into military service. Egypt had long transformed defeated foreigners into servants of the kingdom. The fate of individuals varied, and the records rarely follow them beyond the moment when their capture confirms the king's success. Some of the people carved as enemies may later have lived within Egyptian territory under new identities and obligations. The naval scene endures because it offers something rare, an ancient image of ships fighting at close quarters during one of history's great periods of upheaval. Yet its deepest meaning lies not in reconstructing each arrow or turn of the rudder. It shows how Egypt wished the crisis to be remembered. The world beyond the frontier had become fluid, mobile, and difficult to classify. At the river mouths, the state converts that uncertainty into a fixed result. Ships stop moving. Enemies lose their names beneath the category of defeat. Ramesses III stands above the chaos, and stone begins the work of making victory eternal. Stone does more than preserve the victory. At Medinet Habu, it organizes the world around it. The naval battle does not stand alone like an illustration removed from a book. It occupies a sacred setting in which walls, gateways, courts, columns, inscriptions, and ritual movement guide the viewer toward one conclusion. Ramesses III has defended Egypt because the gods support his rule, and the survival of the kingdom proves that cosmic order still holds. The temple rises on the west bank of Thebes near the edge of the desert and the realm of the dead. Its enclosure and monumental gateways make it resemble both sanctuary and stronghold. Visitors entering the complex pass through spaces saturated with royal power. Scenes of foreign warfare appeared beside religious ceremonies and offerings, linking military success with divine service. The king who strikes enemies is the same king who presents gifts to the gods. Violence at the frontier becomes part of worship because defeat of foreigners is presented as restoration of Mayat, the ordered condition on which Egypt depends. This framework explains why the reliefs cannot be separated cleanly into history on one wall and theology on another. The battle scenes are historical in the sense that they refer to real campaigns, named groups, weapons, ships, and captives. They are theological because those events are arranged according to a timeless pattern. The king confronts chaos, receives divine strength, destroys rebellion, and renews the land. Earlier pharaohs had used the same grammar for centuries. Ramesses III employed it as the old international order broke apart. His artistic program deliberately recalls Ramesses II. Names, compositions, and royal poses connect the 20th dynasty ruler to the celebrated king whose monuments still dominated Egypt. Some scenes draw so closely on established models that the message of continuity is unmistakable. Ramesses III presents himself not as a ruler improvising during decline, but as the rightful heir to Egypt's greatest age. Borrowing an older visual formula did not make the new wars fictional. It made them legible within a tradition the audience understood. Scale performs much of the argument. The king appears larger than ordinary soldiers and captives, not because Egyptian artists believed his body literally towered above them, but because size expresses rank and power. Enemy figures are numerous, compressed, falling, bound, or arranged for counting. Egyptian troops act with discipline beneath royal command. Confusion exists only among opponents. The composition eliminates hesitation, reversals, and battlefield accidents. A battle that must have been noisy and uncertain becomes a stable geometry of authority. Names strengthen that geometry. Lists of Peleset, Tjeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh create the impression that the state has identified and contained every component of the threat. Captives are grouped according to appearance and label. Scribes count hands or other trophies in scenes of military accounting, converting bodies into totals and totals into proof. Egyptian victory was not complete until it had been recorded. Administration extends conquest beyond the battlefield. What the soldier captures, the scribe classifies, and what the scribe classifies, the king claims. The numbers recorded in royal inscriptions deserve caution. Ancient victory accounts frequently use totals to magnify success, and there is no independent archive against which the figures at Medinet Habu can be checked. Some may derive from genuine battlefield counts, while others may have been rounded, expanded, or shaped by literary convention. Scholars still debate how literally individual totals should be read. Their political function, however, is clear. Precision creates authority. A statement that the enemy was crushed is powerful. A specific number killed or captured appears almost bureaucratically undeniable. The inscriptions also place the conflict on an enormous stage. Foreign lands are said to have been uprooted, scattered, or gathered in conspiracy. Regions appear to fall in sequence before the enemy advances toward Egypt. The language gives Ramesses III a role larger than defending one frontier. He becomes the ruler who stops a process that has overwhelmed the rest of the world. This may preserve Egyptian awareness of genuine destruction abroad, but it also elevates the campaign into a universal drama. The more complete the surrounding collapse appears, the more miraculous Egypt's survival becomes. The audience was not limited to foreign envoys or soldiers, priests, officials, workmen, festival participants, and later kings encountered the temple. Rituals renewed the dead ruler's connection with the gods. Inscriptions could be read aloud, summarized, or absorbed visually by people unable to follow every sign. Even those who could not read hieroglyphs understood the central image: the pharaoh stands upright while foreigners fall. Architecture made the conclusion physical. To move through the temple was to enter a world where royal victory had become sacred reality. Yet reception was not passive or uniform. Officials knew that campaigns cost grain, labor, weapons, animals, and lives. Soldiers who had fought may have remembered events less neatly than the walls presented them. Communities near the frontiers may have understood foreign groups through trade, intermarriage, or local conflict rather than as symbols of cosmic disorder. The monument does not preserve those perspectives. Its success lies partly in replacing them with one authorized memory. This is why the placement of scenes matters as much as their content. Modern photographs isolate individual panels, allowing ships or feathered warriors to circulate without the temple around them. At Medinet Habu, however, image, text, and location operate together. A caption beside a battle scene directs interpretation. A god facing the king legitimizes the action. Repeated victories in different spaces create accumulation. The visitor encounters a network of claims reinforcing one another. The naval relief has often been treated as a record of the sea peoples, yet it is also an image of Ramesses III's desired identity. The enemy fleet matters because it allows the king to demonstrate foresight, preparation, and command. The foreigners are individualized just enough to appear real, then subordinated to a pattern that denies them agency. Their journey ends where the Egyptian story requires it to end. This does not reduce Medinet Habu to deception. Propaganda is most effective when attached to recognizable events. Egypt did fight major wars. The northern threat was serious. Captives were taken, and the state survived. The distortion lies in completeness. One ruler receives all credit. Divine favor explains success. Egyptian losses disappear, and political complexity is condensed into rebellion defeated. The monument tells the truth of royal power more clearly than the full truth of war. Centuries later, when names of vanished peoples had faded elsewhere, the walls kept speaking. They preserved ships, weapons, costumes, and claims that no other source records so vividly. But they also preserve the court's control over memory. To look beyond that control, the story must leave the carved triumph and ask what archaeology can confirm in the burned cities, changing settlements, imported pottery, human remains, and surviving communities beyond Egypt's borders. Archaeology does not provide the clean verdict that royal inscriptions promise. It gives fragments, burned floors, abandoned rooms, repaired walls, changed pottery, altered diets, imported objects disappearing from one layer and reappearing in another. These traces are less dramatic than the reliefs at Medinet Habu, but they are harder to bend into a single story. They show that the Eastern Mediterranean did not fall in one synchronized wave, and that the people named by Egypt cannot be matched neatly to every destruction between Anatolia and the Nile. At Ugarit, the final destruction is real. Buildings burned, archives were buried, and the city never recovered its former role. Yet the attackers are not identified by an inscription left at the site. Enemy ships appear in letters, but no tablet says that Peleset, Tjeker, or any other named group destroyed the city. The temptation to connect every ruin to the Sea Peoples is understandable, because the dates are close, and the Egyptian texts describe lands collapsing before the invaders. Still, proximity is not proof. Ugarit may have fallen to maritime raiders, regional enemies, internal breakdown, or a combination of pressures that the surviving documents cannot fully resolve. The same caution applies elsewhere. Hattusa was abandoned and partly burned, but evidence suggests a more complex end than a sudden sack by a foreign fleet. Some Mycenaean palaces were destroyed, yet others declined in stages or were reoccupied. On Cyprus, several settlements show destruction followed by rebuilding, while others continued with substantial local continuity. In the southern Levant, some cities were damaged, some transformed, and some grew. A map covered with flames creates the illusion of one coordinated assault, but the archaeological sequence is staggered and regionally varied. Chronology is one of the main reasons certainty remains elusive. Pottery styles can date layers only within ranges. Radiocarbon measurements require calibration and often produce overlapping possibilities. A destruction assigned broadly to the early 12th century BC may have occurred years or decades before another event placed in the same conventional horizon. New Bayesian models are refining the transition from the Late Bronze to the Iron Age in Canaan, but they reinforce rather than erase complexity. Different settlements crossed that threshold at different times. Material culture provides stronger evidence for movement than destruction alone. In parts of the southern Levant, especially at early Philistine sites, pottery inspired by Aegean traditions appears alongside changes in cooking practices, architecture, weaving, and food choices. Some households consumed pork more often than neighbouring communities, though this pattern varied by site and period. Loom weights, hearth designs, and decorated ceramics suggest that newcomers or people with strong Western connections entered the region. Yet these features were quickly adapted using local clay, local techniques, and Levantine forms. The result was not a foreign culture sealed off from its surroundings, but a hybrid society forming through contact. Ancient DNA from Ashkelon supports this picture. Individuals dating to the early Iron Age carried a genetic component related to populations from Europe, consistent with migration from somewhere around the Aegean or southern European world. Within a few centuries, that component became much less visible as the newcomers mixed with local people. The finding is important because it confirms biological movement, not merely imitation of foreign objects, but it does not identify the migrants as Peleset with absolute certainty, locate a single homeland, or explain every sea peoples group. One city cannot stand for an entire Eastern Mediterranean crisis. Stable isotope studies can also reveal whether individuals grew up near the places where they were buried. Results from several regions indicate mobility, but not one uniform stream. Some people moved long distances, while many remained local. This is exactly what a fractured world should produce: multiple journeys, not one migration. Warriors, artisans, traders, captives, and families could arrive by different routes and enter different communities. Archaeology finds the consequences of movement more easily than the names used by those who moved. The Egyptian claim that Ramesses III settled defeated peoples in strongholds or assigned them under royal control has often been connected to the rise of Philistine cities. The Great Harris Papyrus describes foreign captives placed in Egypt's service and taxed in goods or clothing. Yet the idea that the king transported the Peleset directly into Philistia as a single resettlement policy is debated. Egyptian authority in Canaan was weakening, and the political landscape after the battles was unstable. Some groups may have settled with Egyptian permission, others beyond effective Egyptian control, and still others through arrangements that left no written record. Even the famous feathered headdresses offer only a limited bridge between art and excavation. Similar visual motifs appear in Eastern Mediterranean contexts, but equipment and costume can spread between groups. A helmet or shield does not prove language, ancestry, or homeland. Egyptian artists may have observed real distinctions, but they also repeated recognizable types. Archaeology rarely recovers the organic materials that would allow a direct comparison with the clothing shown on temple walls. What archaeology does confirm is that migration and cultural mixing were genuine parts of the transition. It confirms that many palace centers failed, that long-distance exchange contracted, and that new communities emerged in the spaces left behind. It confirms destruction at important sites, but not one destroyer. It confirms Western connections in the southern Levant, but not a unified invasion from a single Western homeland. It confirms that people survived the collapse by moving, adapting, and combining traditions. The record also reveals continuity that royal narratives ignore. Local pottery traditions persisted beneath new decorative styles. Canaanite languages remained dominant. Agricultural practices continued. Temples, houses, and settlement patterns often blended older and newer elements. The people later called Philistines became part of Levantine society, rather than remaining permanent outsiders. Their identity changed as generations passed, just as the identities of those absorbed into Egypt must have changed. This is the central contradiction between stone and soil. Medinet Habu freezes enemies at the moment of defeat, preserving them forever as foreign bodies outside Egyptian order. Archaeology follows what happened afterward and finds boundaries dissolving. Captives become workers or soldiers. Migrants become neighbors. Imported customs become local traditions. Populations remembered as invaders participate in the creation of new societies. The silence is especially revealing. No shared capital, archive, burial custom, or administrative system has emerged that could belong to a single confederation commanding the entire movement. No excavation has uncovered the complete Sea People's story because no complete story may ever have existed. The name gathers together movements that were separate, overlapping, and uneven. The evidence confirms upheaval, migration, warfare, and institutional collapse, but it refuses the simplicity of one cause or one army. Beneath every royal claim lies a more difficult landscape, where cities fell for different reasons and survivors built the Iron Age from the remains. The ruins do not point toward one murderer because the Bronze Age world did not die from one wound. Drought weakened harvests, but many societies had survived bad years before. Warfare destroyed cities, but war had long been part of interstate life. Trade routes failed, yet local exchange continued. Migrants moved across land and sea, but movement alone does not explain why palace systems collapsed almost simultaneously across such a wide region. The end came through interaction. Each pressure made the others harder to absorb, until institutions built for expansion could no longer manage contraction. Climate formed part of that pressure. Evidence from Anatolia and the southern Levant indicates prolonged dryness interrupted by especially severe episodes. Reduced rainfall meant smaller harvests, diminished pasture, and greater competition for water. A palace could respond by releasing stored grain, purchasing food abroad, or reducing obligations. Those remedies depended on reserves, secure roads, functioning ports, and rulers willing to sacrifice revenue. When several regions faced shortage together, imports became expensive or unavailable. A climate shock that might once have remained local entered the political system and spread. Food insecurity then altered military decisions. Armies required grain, animals, transport, and labor. Garrisoning frontiers removed workers from fields. Campaigns destroyed crops and interrupted planting. Rulers under threat often demanded additional tribute from dependent territories, transferring scarcity from the center to the provinces. The attempt to preserve imperial power could therefore erode the communities expected to sustain it. Grain shortages did not simply produce hunger, they weakened loyalty, restricted strategy, and made every conflict more costly. Trade failure deepened the damage. Bronze production depended on copper and tin arriving from different regions, while royal workshops relied on timber, glass, ivory, textiles, and specialist labor. A palace unable to obtain imported materials could not reward elites or equip forces in the old manner. Merchants avoided dangerous waters, ships were requisitioned for war, and ports lost access to distant partners. The disappearance of luxury goods mattered politically because rulers used such objects to maintain alliances and display legitimacy. When gifts stopped moving, relationships frayed along with commerce. The network had been designed around concentrated centers. Palaces collected agricultural surplus, stored it, redistributed it, and used it to support scribes, soldiers, artisans, priests, and administrators. This concentration made impressive projects possible, but it also created dependency. When the palace burned or lost control of its territory, the specialists around it lost food and employment. Written administration disappeared because the institutions that required it vanished. Local communities could continue farming, yet the larger system connecting them to armies, markets, and courts broke apart. Internal political conflict added another layer. Succession disputes, rival elites, provincial resistance, and declining confidence in rulers could weaken states before an external attack occurred. A king facing rebellion had fewer troops for the coast. Officials uncertain about the future might hoard resources or defect. Subjects asked to surrender grain during scarcity could resist palace demands. The surviving royal texts rarely admit these tensions, because kings preferred enemies who came visibly from abroad. internal failure was hard to transform into a heroic victory. Earthquakes may have damaged some cities, particularly in tectonically active zones, but destruction layers cannot all be assigned to one regional earthquake storm. Fire followed many causes: assault, accident, rebellion, abandonment, or burning during later occupation. Disease may also have travelled through crowded ports and mobile populations, although direct evidence remains limited. These possibilities matter because already weakened societies did not need one overwhelming catastrophe. Several moderate shocks arriving together could produce the same result. Mobility was both consequence and cause. Families left areas where crops failed or authority vanished. Sailors and soldiers sought new employers. Captives were resettled. Mercenary bands attached themselves to leaders able to provide food and prospects. Some groups raided because raiding had become more profitable than trade. Their movement placed pressure on other communities, which then displaced further populations. The people later called Sea Peoples may have included participants at several points in this chain, but they were not standing outside the system. They came from the world that was collapsing. This helps explain why the same population could appear as trader, mercenary, migrant, and enemy. Categories changed with circumstance. A sailor whose port no longer functioned might join an armed fleet. A soldier dismissed by a fallen palace might follow a local chief. A community denied grain might seize it elsewhere. None of this excuses violence, but it replaces the fantasy of a mysterious race arriving without history. The attackers had histories, dependencies, and losses of their own. Egypt survived because several protective factors remained intact. The Nile supported a large agricultural base. Central administration still mobilized grain and manpower. Fortified approaches guarded the delta. The army had experience incorporating foreign troops and responding to Libyan coalitions. Ramesses III could concentrate resources at critical points, while northern states were losing that capacity. Geography also placed distance between Egypt's core and the first centers of collapse. The kingdom received warning before the crisis reached its borders. Yet survival carried costs. Every campaign consumed stored grain, weapons, animals, ships, and labor. Captives could replenish manpower, but they also required control and integration. Temple donations and monumental building continued because the king needed to display divine favor. Even as the fiscal base came under pressure, victory prevented immediate conquest. It did not restore the Hittite Empire, reopen every trade route, or rebuild the international system on which Egyptian influence had depended. The phrase Bronze Age collapse therefore describes several endings layered together. It was the collapse of palace administrations, imperial authority, diplomatic exchange, and some forms of long-distance trade. It was also a period of destruction and displacement. But it was not a universal extinction. Villages survived, local markets adapted, and new political communities emerged. For many people, the old world ended not in one dramatic night, but through years in which taxes rose. Ships stopped arriving, officials disappeared, and familiar protections failed. No single cause is enough because the system failed through feedback. Drought reduced grain, shortage intensified extraction. Extraction encouraged unrest and migration. War disrupted production and trade. Trade failure weakened courts. Weak courts could not defend routes or relieve famine. Mobile groups exploited the resulting openings, creating further insecurity. Each response narrowed the choices available to the next ruler or community. Ramesses III's victories interrupted that cycle at Egypt's frontier, but only temporarily. The walls of Medinet Habu present a king who ended the crisis by defeating its human face. Beyond the monument, the deeper forces remained. The old Mediterranean order had already dissolved, and Egypt's success would be measured not by returning that world, but by how long the kingdom could continue without it. Its victory bought time, and that time would expose the growing weaknesses hidden behind the surviving walls of royal power. Egypt had stopped the attackers, but it had not stopped the age from changing. Ramesses III remained on the throne. The Nile Valley remained controlled, and the temples continued to proclaim that order had been restored, against the destruction farther north. This was extraordinary. Egypt did not lose its capital, its royal dynasty, or its agricultural heartland to the forces at Medinet Habu. Yet the kingdom that survived was no longer supported by the same international world, and victory could not replace the wealth and influence that world had once provided. The wars themselves were expensive. Armies had to be gathered, equipped, fed, and transported. Horses and chariots required care. Ships needed timber, rope, crews, provisions, and repairs. Fortresses along the northeastern approaches had to be maintained while the western frontier remained vulnerable to further Libyan pressure. Every successful mobilization demonstrated the strength of the state, but each also drew down stores and labor that could not be replaced easily when foreign trade contracted. Ramesses III continued to rule in the language of abundance. His inscriptions describe enemies crushed, captives settled, temples enriched, and expeditions dispatched to obtain materials. The Great Harris Papyrus presents his reign as a period of restoration after disorder. It records enormous offerings to the gods and celebrates the king as a generous protector of Egypt. The scale is impressive, but the document was written after his death to honor him and strengthen the legitimacy of Ramesses IV. It transforms a difficult reign into a success. Temple wealth formed a central part of that image. Ramesses III granted land, personnel, livestock, grain, and manufactured goods to major cults, especially Ammon's temple at Thebes. Such gifts were not religious generosity. They reinforced alliances with priesthoods, ensured ritual support for the king, and displayed the state's ability to command resources. Yet large temple estates also accumulated economic power. Land and labor placed under sacred administration did not disappear from Egypt's economy, but they could become less directly available to the crown. Over time, this shift contributed to a political landscape in which the royal centre shared authority with institutions it had enriched. The kingdom also faced the consequences of losing control abroad. During the New Kingdom's strongest centuries, Egypt had drawn tribute, strategic depth, and prestige from territories in Nubia and the Levant. Its influence in Canaan depended on garrisons, local rulers, roads and ports functioning within a wider network. After the crisis, Egyptian authority in the southern Levant contracted. Some strongholds continued for a time, but the old imperial structure weakened. New political communities emerged, including the early Philistine cities, highland settlements, and local Canaanite successors. Egypt had defended the Delta, yet the buffer beyond it was becoming independent and less predictable. This retreat affected more than maps. Levantine timber, copper from Cyprus, imported oils, wine, luxury goods, and diplomatic exchange had all supported elite life and state projects. Trade did not vanish completely, but its scale and organization changed. Routes became more regional. Palace-sponsored commerce diminished. Egypt could still send expeditions and obtain foreign materials, but the secure system that had once connected great courts no longer existed. The kingdom increasingly had to sustain its ambitions from a narrower base. The strain becomes visible in the community of royal tomb workers at Deir el-Medina. These skilled labourers were responsible for cutting and decorating the tombs of kings and queens in the Theban cliffs. They were state employees paid in grain rations, and their records provide an unusually close view of administrative life. In the 29th year of Ramesses III, deliveries failed repeatedly. Workers stopped work and gathered in protest, demanding the food owed to them. Their action is often described as the earliest well-documented labour strike in history. The episode is remarkable because it breaks through the monumental image of abundance. The men were not rebels seeking to overthrow the king. They appealed to officials, temples, and the moral obligation of the state to provide their rations. Their protest shows that administrative channels still existed, but also that those channels were failing. Grain was available somewhere in Egypt, yet corruption, shortage, delayed transport, or institutional weakness prevented regular distribution to an important workforce. Scholars still debate the balance of causes, but the contrast with the victory inscriptions is sharp. A king could defeat foreign fleets and still struggle to deliver wages within sight of his own memorial temple. Other records from the later 20th dynasty reveal rising tomb robbery, official misconduct, local insecurity, and disputes over resources. These problems should not all be projected backward as if Egypt collapsed immediately after the battles. Ramesses III's reign retained substantial power, and many institutions continued effectively. The decline was gradual, uneven, and interrupted by moments of recovery. What changed was the state's capacity to meet every obligation while preserving the grand scale of New Kingdom kingship. The end of Ramesses III's life exposed instability at the centre. A conspiracy within the royal household sought to replace the designated successor with another prince. Judicial papyri record the trials of conspirators, officials, and participants associated with the plot. Modern examination of the king's mummy indicates that he died from a severe wound to the throat, strongly supporting the conclusion that the assassination attempt succeeded. The details of responsibility remain debated, but the event reveals a court divided beneath the public image of divine order. Ramesses inherited the throne and ensured that his father was remembered as a victorious ruler. The monumental and written record did its work well. Later generations saw Ramesses III as the last great warrior pharaoh of the New Kingdom, the king who stopped Libya and the Sea Peoples while other states fell. That reputation is not false. His military response preserved Egypt's core and prevented the crisis from entering the Nile Valley on the scale seen elsewhere. But survival was not renewal. Egypt could defend its borders more successfully than it could restore the lost Bronze Age system. The wars protected a kingdom already becoming more inward, more dependent on its temples, and less able to project lasting power into Asia. After Ramesses III, royal authority continued to weaken. Libyan communities gained influence within Egypt, and the high priests of Amun accumulated increasing power in the south. By the end of the 20th dynasty, political unity had fractured. The victory at Medinet Habu therefore belongs to two histories at once. In one, Egypt resists the forces that destroyed or displaced other states and remained standing. In the other, the cost of survival reveals how much the kingdom has already lost. The carved king appears untouched by time, but the state behind him is entering a long retreat. Egypt won the battles of the 8th year. It could not win back the world in which those battles had become necessary. The enemies on the walls of Medinet Habu remain forever in motion and forever unable to arrive. Their ships lean into the river battle. Their carts press southward behind warriors. Their leaders stand bound before the king. Their names remain visible: Peleset, Tjeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh. Yet the lands from which those names came have never been recovered with certainty. 3,000 years later, the people presented as a single danger still have no single homeland, no shared capital, and no surviving voice that explains why they moved. That absence is not a blank space waiting for one final discovery to solve everything. It may reflect the nature of the movement itself. The forces encountered by Ramesses III could have been assembled from several regions and several kinds of community. Some may have come from the Aegean, others from Anatolia, Cyprus, or the Levant. Some were probably sailors familiar with palace trade. Others may have been soldiers whose employers had disappeared, leaders gathering followers, or families searching for land after older settlements failed. The evidence remains incomplete, but it increasingly points away from a unified nation advancing under one command. Their identities may also have changed during the journey. A name carried from one coast could acquire new members at another. A military following might absorb refugees, captives, craftsmen, and local allies. People who began as subjects of a palace could become mercenaries after that palace fell, then settlers when fighting ended. By the time Egyptian scribes classified them, the groups may already have been products of collapse rather than ancient peoples preserved unchanged from distant homelands. This is why the search for origins produces so many plausible but unproven connections. The Peleset fit most convincingly within the formation of Philistine society, yet even there the picture is mixed. Archaeology and DNA indicate migration from the West, while language, material culture, and ancestry quickly blended with the Levantine population. The Tjeker may have found a place along the coast near Dor, but certainty remains beyond reach. The Shekelesh have been connected with Sicily, the Denyen with Aegean or Anatolian traditions, and the Weshesh with almost every direction permitted by imagination. Similar names create clues, not verdicts. The deeper legacy of these groups may therefore lie less in where they started than in what they became. In the southern Levant, new communities emerge from migrants and local inhabitants living together after the collapse of palace rule. Imported-looking pottery was made from local clay. Foreign food customs changed within generations. Genetic differences became less distinct as families mixed. The people who entered history as outsiders became part of the societies that followed. Egypt's monument freezes them at the border, but human life continued beyond the frame. Some captives may have entered Egypt itself. Royal texts describe defeated foreigners assigned to strongholds, temple estates, labor, or military service. Their descendants may have spoken Egyptian, worshipped Egyptian gods, and carried identities no inscription bothered to record. Egypt had long turned enemies into subjects and foreign soldiers into defenders of the crown. The rigid division between Egyptian and outsider was strongest in royal ideology, not necessarily in everyday life. Ramesses III's victory also became part of a longer transformation. The campaigns prevented a catastrophic penetration of the Nile Valley, but they did not restore the Bronze Age world. The Hittite Empire did not return. Ugarit scribes did not reopen their archives. The Mycenaean palaces did not resume their old administration. Trade continued in altered forms. Smaller kingdoms emerged, and new identities took shape across the eastern Mediterranean. The Iron Age was not built after everyone vanished. It was built by survivors who reused routes, languages, skills, and memories under different political conditions. For Egypt, the memory of the war outlived the security it celebrated. Ramesses III's successors inherited his images but not his full authority. This state became increasingly divided, its influence abroad contracted, and powerful institutions within Egypt accumulated greater independence. Yet Medinet Habu endured. Its walls protected the king's preferred version of events even as the kingdom around them changed. The monument succeeded because it turned a temporary military achievement into a timeless statement. That statement still shapes modern imagination. The phrase "Sea Peoples" evokes fleets appearing from darkness and civilizations falling before them. It gives the collapse a recognizable enemy and offers a human face for a process otherwise scattered across climate records, trade routes, ruined palaces, and uncertain chronologies. But the clarity is deceptive. The Sea Peoples did not arrive outside history. They belong to the same connected world as the kingdoms they fought. They used its ships, weapons, roads, and military traditions. They may have traded with its cities, served in its armies, and suffered from its failures before becoming agents of further disruption. No single explanation fully accounts for the end of the Bronze Age because no single experience defined it. To a Hittite official, collapse may have meant orders no longer reaching the provinces. To an Ugaritic merchant, it may have meant ships failing to return. To a farmer, it could mean another dry season and a heavier demand for grain. To a sailor, it might mean joining an armed crew because peaceful trade no longer offered survival. To Ramesses III, it meant enemies approaching the frontiers and an opportunity to prove that he alone could preserve order. His achievement should neither be dismissed as propaganda nor accepted exactly as propaganda presents it. Egypt fought and won important battles. Its preparation, military organization, geography, and agricultural strength mattered. The royal court then selected, enlarged, and sanctified those victories. The result is a record that is invaluable precisely because it contains history and ideology together. Its ships reveal ancient naval warfare, while their arrangement reveals how kings controlled memory. Its names preserve vanished groups, while their silence reveals the limits of royal knowledge. The most accurate image is not a mysterious nation sweeping across a helpless world. It is a crowded horizon during a period when people were moving for many reasons, some violently and some desperately, through a network that no longer protected them. Egypt stopped part of that movement at its border. Other groups settled, dispersed, or disappeared into new populations. Their separate stories became compressed beneath one modern title. Just as the court of Ramesses III compressed complicated wars into one triumph of order over chaos, the enemy without a homeland remains because the homeland may never have been one place. It may have been a chain of broken ports, abandoned palaces, dry fields, military camps, and ships moving between coasts. The mystery survives not because evidence tells us nothing, but because it tells us that the past was more fluid than the categories preserved in stone. And so the carved fleet remains upon the temple wall, held in a battle that can never end. The arrows never finish falling. The ships never clear the channel. Ramesses never lowers his bow. Outside the stone, however, the captives grow older, migrants build houses, languages mingle, and children inherit stories whose first journeys they may no longer remember. Kingdoms change their names, harbours fill with silt, river branches wander through the delta and disappear. The silence around them is not empty. It contains all the decisions that were never carved, where to stop, whom to trust, what to carry, which customs to keep, and which names to surrender. Archaeology recovers a cooking pot, a repaired wall, a strand of ancestry, or grain burned inside a storeroom. From such small survivals, the vanished world returns briefly, not as certainty, but as human presence. Time is kinder to monuments than to explanations. A wall can survive while the voices that gave us vent meaning fade away. Names remain legible after their owners have become impossible to find. Victory appears permanent because defeat was not permitted its own inscription. Yet beneath every royal image lies the quieter truth that survival rarely belongs to one king. It belongs to farmers who plant after armies pass, sailors who learn new waters, families who join unfamiliar communities, and craftsmen who reshape old traditions into something suited to a changed world. The end of an age is seldom the end of everyone within it. Palaces become ruins, but paths can continue between villages. Bronze grows scarce, but tools are made from other metals. Great diplomatic languages fall silent, but ordinary speech carries on beside fields and hearths. People adapt without knowing that later centuries will call their lives a collapse. Egypt endured, though not unchanged. The newcomers endured too, though many lost the names by which Egypt had recorded them. What remains is a meeting at the edge of the Nile between a kingdom determined to preserve its order and people carried forward by the disorder of a wider world. In the deepening quiet of Medinet Habu, evening light moves across the ships and feathered warriors. Shadows gather inside the carved lines. The battle slowly recedes from sight, but the stone continues to hold its question. Not simply who attacked Egypt, or where they began, but how many human stories disappear when history remembers only the king who stood still while everyone else was moving.